Hi, I'm Sarah Archer. I'm owner of Heart Earthworm Farm. I'm really happy to be here with you today. And we're going to talk about worms. So, when you think about worms, what kind of words come into your mind? Think about that for just a minute. Are they gross to you? Have you ever picked up a worm? What do they feel like? How do they move? What are worms on this earth for anyway? Those are all really good questions, and probably some of you have worked with worms a little bit, seeing them out in your yard, seeing them in your garden, maybe even seeing them on the sidewalk after it rains really hard. Well, today I want to teach you a little bit about worms and how they help us on our planet and in our soil and help us to grow healthy food. So first, let's talk about the worm's body. Worms are pretty unique in that they don't have any eyes or ears. And so they still do have a head end of their body, and that is called the anterior end of their body, or the head end. And I like to think of that and remember anterior as like antenna or antlers on an animal. So that's the word anterior, is that front end of the worm. The other part of the worm is their tail end, the posterior end, and that's the bottom end of their worm. And just like all living creatures, what goes in must come out, and it goes through their body and comes out as worm castings, or yes, worm's poop. So, a little chuckle there, right? All right. Now, the worms have these little tiny lines that you can see with your eyes if you look at a worm up close that are called segments. And they fall in line with the worm's circular muscles that wrap the body of the worm, and this helps them to move along. They also, underneath their body, have these little tiny bristles that you cannot see with your own eyes that are called setae. And they're like little hairs that are under the worm's body that will help them to grab onto the earth or grab onto the soil as they're trying to move around using their muscles. The other thing that's really curious about worms is that they don't have any teeth. So any pictures that you see of worms with eyes and teeth are really just cartoon figures and aren't going to be really what you'll see when you look at a worm up close. But interestingly, if you look at a worm up close and you put one in your hand and maybe have a little magnifying glass, if you're really lucky, you might see what's called the prostomium flap. And the worms use that. That's going to be on the anterior end of their body. They use that little flap kind of like, it looks like a little nose maybe, but that's what they use to kind of grab on things, to pull it into their mouth so that they can eat it. I think it's also kind of funny because it looks like a little feeler, so maybe they're feeling their way around with that flap. One other thing that you might notice on a worm, and you may not see this on all worms, is this band. How many of you have seen a worm with a band around its body? That band is going to be found closer to the head end of the body, and that is called the clitellum. And that means if you see that band, that is an adult worm, and that worm is able to reproduce. So you'll know if you have a small worm without a band, it's probably just a teenager. And if you see one with the nice band there, that it's going to be an adult that's able to reproduce and have babies. Now, let's talk about babies a little bit. Worms have both organs for male and female, but it still takes two worms to reproduce. And so when you see the worms reproducing, they will still be joined together by the clitellum. They will exchange with each other what they need to create baby cocoons. Yes, they have cocoons, somewhat similar to what you might think of with an insect, but worms are not insects. What will happen is that band will begin to harden around the worm. And so it will actually back away from that band around their head end, and they will drop that little cocoon into the soil, and that cocoon will hatch. And it will hatch up to 5 baby worms inside. So it's really just a miracle of life that those little baby worms come out of that tiny little egg. And we can hopefully find one for you when we look right into our live worm bin in just a little bit. All right. Now, our farm is called Heart Earthworm Farm, and the reason that we call it Heart Earthworm Farm is because worms have 5 hearts. Now, that's pretty amazing. I like to think about, as humans, we have 1 heart, and we're pretty strong. What if we had 5 hearts? There's got to be a reason a worm has 5 hearts. Let's think about that. Where do worms live? Worms live in the soil. They live in the earth. Is the earth hard or soft? Well, it depends on where you live, right? For the most part, the earth is pretty hard. And so 5 hearts gives worms the strength to be able to dig into the earth and help open up the soil. So that's really an important thing that differentiates worms from other creatures on our planet is the 5 hearts. So I hope you find them to be pretty interesting. I sure did. I thought it was cool enough that I wanted to name my business after that. All right, so let's think about worms and what do they do on our planet? Well, they're just long and skinny, and yes, they're slimy. I hope that's a word you thought of when you were thinking about worms. They are slimy for a reason. So another interesting thing about worms is they do not have lungs to breathe like we do. We breathe our air through our lungs. They breathe their air through their skin. And so if you were to cut open a human body and look into our lungs, you would find that they are very moist and slimy. And so just like the worm, their body has to stay slimy in order to be able to breathe in the oxygen that they need to survive. And so we want to make sure they stay slimy and stay nice and moist so that they can survive and live. And of course, you'll find more worms where there's actually a nice moist soil and a moist environment. So what we're going to talk about next is what worms eat. Now, out in nature, worms are part of the whole food web of decomposers. The worms that we use at our farm are called red worms. They are the surface dwelling worm. So that means they live in about the top 12 to 15 inches of our soil, and their job is to help break down the things that fall to the earth. The fallen leaves, dead animals, twigs, they're just part of this whole web of critters and creatures that will break things down and return it to the soil where it belongs. Now, our worms in our worm farm, and if you have a worm bin that you create for your home, are really going to be vegetarian or vegan. We feed them just vegetables and fruit waste, mainly because even though they can help break down the dead animals out in nature, they break down really slowly. And putting any kind of animal fat or animal meat into your bin is going to probably create an odor that you are not going to like. So we always recommend that you just stay away from animals, fats, animal meats, and even dairy products, because they will also kind of smell up your bin, and that's just not fun to have around. All right, so we've got, I do want to show you just an example of some of the food scraps that I collected from my kitchen this morning so that you can see what they look like. So I have this handy dandy bucket that I keep near my kitchen sink so that when I'm cooking, I'm able to just toss things right inside there as I'm cooking. These are mainly peels that you'll see in there, banana peels and an apple core, but we do have some coffee grounds in there because my family likes to drink coffee too. Did you notice maybe the end of the tomato that we really didn't want to eat from our garden? That went inside of there too. My husband picked our cucumbers, but we waited a little bit too long to eat it, so they're kind of mushy. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that the worms get to eat that for us. So when you have a worm farm like we do, we are doing this on a really large scale, although not super large, but bigger than what you would have in your home. It's different, a little different than what you will do at home. So I'm going to teach you how you can do this in your own home to collect your food scraps for composting. Okay, so I'm really excited to show you my working worm bin. And yes, this is just a plastic tote. The plastic tote that you see in front of you is an 18-gallon tote. And what you're looking at right now is just the lid of the worm bin. Now, the worm bin, we want to make sure that because we've learned about the worm's anatomy a little bit, that we create an environment for the worm that's going to help them to be able to survive and live a long, healthy life. That makes me think. I didn't talk to you about how long do worms live? Well, out in nature, worms live about 2 years because they become prey and food for something else. But in our little worm bin here or at our farm, they're going to live double that, maybe 4 to 5 years. So we're helping them to live a longer, happier life because all they're getting is lots of fun food that they love to eat. Okay, so I'm going to open up the bin so you can see the inside. And it's okay, you don't have to jump back. They're little guys. Okay. There we go. Oh, what do you see? Hey, I don't see any worms. And that's a good thing. When you build a worm bin, you want to make sure that you have a nice moist layer of bedding. This is what I call our bedding. So it's the worm's bin. It's where they live. The bedding itself, you can see, is just made from newspaper that I've shredded by hand. And it's nice and moist to help the worm's body stay slimy. Let's take a peek and see if we can discover some worms. Let's pull this bedding apart. Oh, there's some food. Let's see if we can find worms on the food. Well, there's a little baby one. He's kind of blending in with the watermelon rind. Oh, if we dig down a little bit, you can see they're just little guys. Our red worms aren't very big at all. And this is a immature worm in the fact that there is not a clitellum on it, so it's not able to reproduce just yet. And you can see him moving around a little bit. And again, if you are able to handle a worm, whether it's a red worm or a larger worm, you might be able to notice that there are the segments on there. You'll be able to figure out which end is the head end and which end is the tail end. You can't tell by the direction it moves because it can move both forward and backward. But you might even get treated with a drop of castings. And then you'll know for sure which end is the tail end. All right, let's put him back in there. He's where he's going to be happy. So you did notice, I hope, that when we opened it up, I said, oh, I don't see any worms, and that's a good thing. The key to having an indoor worm bin so that you don't have any problems with fruit flies is to make sure that the bedding covers all of the food. Now, eventually, the bedding will get eaten, will decompose and get eaten by the worms, and so you will have to add more bedding to your bin. And I'll show you that in just a moment here about how you can do that. But you'll always want to make sure when you feed your worms that you pull the bedding back, you lay your food underneath of your bedding. And I just happen to have fake banana here. You're going to lay it under and cover it up. If you can still see the food that you've just put down in there, then it's time to add more bedding. That's how you're going to know. The moisture will help keep the worms happy and moist, and it will also help keep the fruit flies away. So that's a really important tip. Okay. Now I want to show you actually how to build your own worm bin. So let's take a moment and show you that. Build our own worm bin for our house. Okay. So I have another worm bin that's empty. So it's one that we're going to just get started. So what I want to show you is that you'll need a couple of things for building your own bin. First of all, you need to have a container. Now, you may have a difficult time finding a Rubbermaid roughneck container just like this one. Any kind of plastic tub will work. It is a good idea to keep it so that it's a little bit more shallow. So one that's 12 inches to 15 inches deep is ideal. You'll also want to make sure, because worms live underground and they need to stay in darkness. So you want to make sure that whatever container you buy is not one that's clear or see-through, that it is solid in color so that the worms, again, aren't going to be getting hit by any light, even though it's not a bright light, it's still going to be light that is going to keep them from actually working on the sides of the bin next to the edges. So we want to be able to let them live throughout the bin, so a dark container works best. All right, because they're living creatures, worms do breathe just like we do, right? They breathe through their skin. So we are going to drill some holes. These are 1/4-inch holes with a drill. And you can just be random with where you put them. There's probably 15 holes in the lid of this container. You're going to also do the same along the sides of the bin. So here I just kind of got fancy and I just made a little design pattern. But you could also just drill some holes along the edges and about the top 1/3 of the bin. You could drill some holes along the sides there. I don't know if you can see them or not. There's some holes. There's 3 on the sides here. You'll also want to make sure, because some of the food that you're going to put into your bin is going to be a high content of moisture, like a cucumber or a watermelon rind. And so we've also drilled some holes into the bottom corners of the bin. And anywhere else that you feel like there might be some liquid that could stand in your bin, you can drill a couple holes in there. Now you might wonder, what are the worms going to try to get out of those holes? Well, guess what? Worms love it where it's moist and dark, and they're going to be so happy in your bin they will not try to escape. And if they are, then there might be something going on with your bin. We'll have to talk about that. All right, so the next step is to actually create the bedding material for the worms. I prefer to use old newspaper, and that's because old newspaper is actually very able to absorb and retain the moisture needed to keep in your bin. There is a trick to how you actually tear the worm bedding into strips, and I'm going to show you that little trick right now. You might be asking yourself, well, we don't get a newspaper. Where am I going to get newspaper? Well, my trick is hotels always have newspapers that they give to their guests. USA Today. There's also the little small trader magazines or trader papers that are at a lot of your restaurants. You can find out if they would be willing to let you have any old ones. Your local library has different stacks of newspapers that they may not want around any longer. So just have to be resourceful and find out where there are newspapers because they are still around. My mom collects them for me. So I receive her Lansing State Journal newspaper, and that's what my worms get. All right, so here's the trick to starting your bedding. If you take a newspaper, just like you were going to read it, and open it up and bend it in half, hang it over your fingers like that. And then if you just, depending if you're right-handed or left-handed, just go to the side that you're hand dominant and just start tearing it down about an inch wide. And you're going to have some strips. Now, you might think, oh, well, why is she showing us how to do this? That's pretty like common sense. But guess what? Paper actually has a grain to it. And so if I didn't hold it this way, but just decided I was going to tear it from this angle, it doesn't tear nice and straight because it's not going with the grain of the paper. So we always want to make sure that we're going with the grain of the paper so it gives us a nice straight strip of newspaper. Okay, we'll still be able to use the rest of this. Once you get the newspaper shredded, they're kind of all still flat together. I like to fluff it up. So we just separate the paper so that they're fluffed out, separated from each other. And this is, again, going to help so that your paper doesn't clump up. We want the worms to be able to go through the bedding, but also hold the moisture. So we don't want it to clump where it isn't going to allow air to pass through. All right, so I already had started with some bedding, some paper in there. Go ahead and set the rest of this. Separate it up. And then you're going to need a squirt bottle. So this is just a flower sprayer, garden sprayer. And we're going to wet this bedding because this, you can kind of hear it, right? It's crunchy. It's dry. That means it's dry. The worms will not like this and won't be able to survive in that dry bedding. And so we're going to moisten this bedding until you'll see the change in the color of the newspaper. It goes kind of from that light gray to a darker gray, and that's helping us to know that it's getting moist. We don't want water standing in the bin, so make sure that just rain. It takes a little patience and a little bit of time to do this part, but it's also kind of relaxing. Okay. Now, I know I'm getting close because I don't hear that crunchy sound of the paper so much. And my paper is starting to turn a darker gray. Very good. And there's no water left in the bottom. So you do this until you have enough to fill your bin about halfway up with newspaper. So this first time you do this, it's going to take quite a few sheets of paper to fill it in. But that's basically how you would start with your bedding. This is the same process you would use when you refill your bin with bedding, except that because your worms are already going to be in here and they're going to be working and living in here, you can start your paper and shred your paper and get it wet outside of the bin, maybe in a bucket, or if you have a laundry tub. You could get that moistened and ready to go to add in because you'll just add it to the top. You won't mix it in. You can just add it right on top so that the paper that's starting to decompose will still continue to decompose instead of putting the new stuff down under the old stuff. Okay. It's at this point that we would add our worms. And so usually we'd start with at least 500 worms, which is a half a pound of red worms, or a pound of worms, which is 1,000 worms. 1,000 worms. Can you imagine 1,000 worms? So we would add our worms into the bin at this point and just lay them on top. Because of the light, they're going to find their way down inside, and then we can start to feed them. Now, you saw my container with my food scraps. There's probably about There's probably about a pound of food in here, and that would be a good enough start for us to feed the worms to begin with. Now, one very important trick is, again, this was too mushy for us to eat, but what I would do for the worms is I would actually take a knife and cut this open. Let's see if it's mushy enough that I can open it up, because the outside skin of this cucumber or any fruit or vegetable is really too hard for the worms to start eating. So we're going to break it open to let the other little microorganisms and bacteria that are in our bin start breaking it down for the worms. Now, this is pretty slimy inside, so I think they're going to like that a lot. So again, I'm going to demonstrate for you how you feed the worms. And the first time we feed them, we're going to peel the bedding back. We're going to lay our food in, and we're going to cover it up so we don't see it. And we could feed them pretty much all the food that I have in my little bin here today, so that they could get a good start. Now, because it's a brand new bin, give it a week, maybe a couple of weeks, so that you can see that the worms have gotten used to their new environment and that they've started to actually eat and break down the food before you feed them again. But after that, you can feed them. I like to feed them just once a week. That way I'm not disturbing them so much and they can keep working on that food. But you can feed them about once a week, a couple of pounds of food. That the more you feed them, the more they're going to populate the bin to break it down. Do stay away from high citrus foods. So citrus foods are your oranges and limes and lemons, and acidic foods like tomatoes. It's okay to put some in, because like, remember, I had my tomato peel, or the top of my tomato, but we wouldn't want to put a whole bunch of rotten tomatoes inside of there, because the acidicness is just too harsh for the worm's skin. Same with the citrus of the juice, or the pulp, and the juice and the skin of oranges or limes and lemons. A little bit's okay. All right, now this is a trick too that I have some friends who do this. I don't do this personally because I'm always really fussy about my bedding and the cover of my food. But if you're concerned about fruit flies, you can actually still freeze all of your vegetables, especially your banana peels or peaches and things like that. And that will help kill the larvae of the fruit fly, so that when you do feed your worms, there'll be less of a chance for you to get fruit flies in your bin. And I'm going to tell you, fruit flies are the demise of a worm bin. Once you get fruit flies, your family will probably say we're done, because they're hard to get rid of. You know, when you get one in the house, they're hard to get rid of, right? So imagine you have 100 or 50. That's even worse. So if you get that problem, you'll have to get a hold of me. I got some tricks on how to do that. You're going to be great. You're going to have enough bedding on your food. You're going to bury your food under your bedding, and you're just not going to have trouble with fruit flies, right? Right. Okay. So after that, after you've fed your worms and you've got your bedding covering all of your food, it's as simple as putting the lid back on, making sure it's nice and sealed. So if you have a dog or a cat in the house that's curious, they don't get it opened up. And then you're going to want to set this in your home. Yes, in your house. The bins are made out of plastic, and so plastic heats up really hot outside. And so there's already going to be heat that's generated inside of your bin, because these are living worms, and there's other little microbes and bacteria that are in there that are creating heat. So your little ecosystem here is going to be warm enough just on its own. Setting it outside or in a sunroom or out in your garage is going to make it heat up even more, and that will be deadly to the worms, and they will die. So we don't want that to happen, right? So the best place for you to put your worms is somewhere that's going to be convenient. So I keep one in my kitchen, I keep one in my office, and when in my other house where I lived before, I kept them in my basement. And so it was a little cooler in the basement, and they didn't produce quite as fast. But the ones that are in my kitchen and the ones that are in my office, it's a perfect temperature for them, and they break down the food really fast. So that means I get their castings a lot sooner. Great. All right. Also, one other tip about where to put your bin is make sure that you don't have anywhere that's near vibrations that are going on constantly. So, for example, probably most homes don't have any place like that, but if you're doing this at school or in a building where you have a register that's running all the time, you probably wouldn't want it next to a blower or a fan that's running constantly, because those vibrations make the worms feel like there's a predator coming, and so they would try to escape. So that's one reason they would try to leave them in. And I have seen that happen in a classroom before, and it was really sad. The students luckily weren't in classroom yet. The teacher found it, and we were able to get them all picked up and buried before the kids came in. But That was an unusual circumstance. The other thing that I want to talk with you about in your worm bin is what do you do once your castings have filled up in your bin, right? Well, the castings are what we're after in the bin. They are the gold of worm composting. So when you have enough your bedding has been eaten, all the food has been eaten, and you're getting like the bin's getting heavy, it's getting filled with all those worm castings, then it's time to basically harvest the castings. Now, this takes a little bit of time, but it's really quite fun. You just take your bedding out, that's any bedding that hasn't broken down, any food that hasn't broken down, and you just pull it out and you set it aside in a bucket. Then all you see are the castings left behind, right? Take out handfuls of the castings and lay them down on a surface area that's covered with either a tablecloth or a plastic bag, and just start making little piles of castings. Kind of create little pyramids. What's going to happen? Worms don't like the light, right? So the worms are going to work their way down into that little pyramid of castings, and you'll be able to scoop the castings right off the top of that pile and put it into a separate bucket. Pretty soon, all you're going to see, once you get all those castings taken away, just worms laying on the surface of your tablecloth. And you'll be able to pick them up, put them into another container until all of your bin is emptied. And then guess what? You can recycle them. You can put them right back in your worm bin and start the process all over again. This is a great time to start another bin. If you have a lot of food waste that you are making at your home, this is a great time to start a second bin, or a great time to share how to build a worm bin with a friend. So it's really just that simple. You shouldn't have any smelly odors. You should always smell it just very earthy smell. So again, keeping it moist, keeping your food buried, and just feeding on a regular basis will give you some really nice castings. Well, Miss Sarah, what do we do with those castings? We talk about this gold. The castings are gold for your health of your soil. Castings, because the food and everything is passed through the worm's gut, picks up all of the beneficial microbes in the worm's body. And because they've pooped it out as their castings, we're adding all those beneficial nutrients to the soil for the plant's root system to uptake and enter into their bodies. I've learned recently that plants are actually quite smart, and they actually will pull from their root system the beneficial nutrients that they need to be a healthy plant. And they will take that up into their roots, into their stems, into their flower, into their seed. And so they are actually changing the makeup of their seed with those beneficial nutrients so that the next time that seed falls and is planted and sprouts, it's going to be even a healthier plant. So we're doing a lot of great things by using castings in our gardens, using castings to grow our healthy food, and all those beneficial nutrients that are going into that plant when we harvest are going into our bodies. So we know we're going to have some healthy food that we're eating. So that's the benefit of having a worm bin in your home and using their castings in your gardens. So you might be wondering how I got started with worms. Well, it actually wasn't because of soil, believe it or not. So I'm a crazy recycler woman. I love to recycle. I love to keep things out of the landfill. And that's really what got me interested in worms. Because I'm a vegetarian, I actually have a lot of different food scraps that I create in my daily life. And so using worms and using a worm bin in my home has actually helped me to keep that stuff out of the landfill. And it's even more important today over the years as I've learned the importance of keeping food scraps out of the landfill, because as they break down in the landfill, they are creating methane gas. And methane gas, as we know, is just one of the worst gases to enter our environment that really exacerbates the heating of our climate. And that's affecting everything around us, our weather, how our plants grow, and so many other things. So as I've been going along, I've learned also, because I wasn't a gardener, I didn't garden at my house at the time. I always gave my castings to my mom, who has beautiful flower gardens. But now I live on a farm and I understand the importance of healthy soil and how beneficial worm castings are to the soil. So now I'm doing it for two good reasons. One, to keep things out of my food scraps out of the landfill, and two, to help people return these wonderful castings to the soil so they can grow healthy food that they can eat.